nations right now. Let's talk about Nubian nations and some of the things with respect to them in their own right. So I hope that you are doing well. God bless you. I want to thank all of you for joining in, and those who've been joining in over the past several days. Thank you so much. And for those who've been looking up my books on Amazon, I very much appreciate. Look at Religion of the Black Land and Stories About Black History by Danita Smith. I very much appreciate that. And They Can't Pull Us Up, Harriet Tubman, Her Life. You could take a look at that. That would be very good. I very much appreciate that. I want to come to you today, and I want to talk a little bit about Nubian nations. As I think about Nubian nations, I think about people with respect to our ancestors and people who have been around in history and made so many contributions to history that we don't think about, right? And when I think about it, so many people have so many bad things to say and biased things to say about various people around the world, about African people in general. It's up to us when it comes to respecting our ancestors, when it comes to looking at them differently and looking at them through a different lens. It's going to be up to us. You can't wait. We can't wait for somebody to come from some university or somebody to come from some place to tell us to look at our ancestors with respect and to look at our ancestors with joy and to see what we can learn from. And that's one of the biggest tricks, I believe, is for people to get you not to look at your heritage and where you came from and people who are like you and make you think they have nothing to contribute. So you won't go back and look at that knowledge. You won't go back and look at exactly how they did what they did. So that whole idea of making you think about yourself and about your ancestors in a way that's negative is a powerful thing. And I think it's up to us to change that. So when I think about Nubian nations, we're going to talk about Nubian nations today. When I think about Nubian nations and I think about the people who were around in ancient Kemet and people who were there, who had their own names. They had their own names, they had their own societies, they had their own distinct societies. And we should not get caught up in not calling their names, not being very vocal about their names just because we want to make a statement about another country there or make a statement about Kemet. We need to be able to call the names, I believe, because I think it's significant in terms of what it is we want to accomplish and what they meant to life. And I think it's so very important because history is not just facts that you talk about or you paint a pretty picture about or you make an artwork about and you put it up on your wall. That's not just what history is. And just because our ancestors, a lot of the things that they were making depictions for, things we would call artifacts now and things we would call art, they were really things that mean something. They were things that meant something, that had symbolism to it, that meant religious significance, that talked about a significant event or family member or documented something that was significant to them. It was their way of being able to write something in stone and to pass on something that was very important. It wasn't just something to just put on a wall and say that's pretty. And I think a lot of times we kind of reduce history to that. And that whole idea, if you've seen some of the things that I've talked about, if you look at my Religion of the Black Land or things I've talked about in terms of Auset, some of the videos with respect to that, maybe I'll put some of that in the description so you can take a look at it. You know that I very much believe that this should be something that helps us. History and the things we talk about should be something that helps us today, right? And one of the main ways we can do that is to begin to look at our ancestors and begin to look at history differently. So when I think about the people here, and I think about the people who lived in ancient Nubia at the time when, Kemet was in its heyday, 3,000 years before Christ, 2,000 years BC, 2,500 BC. Who were they? What were their names? Let's talk about them a little bit. Let's give some perspective on them, because if you don't do it and if I don't do it, it will never get done. And it becomes a fundamentally important thing, I believe, for us, ourselves, and for our children to be able to look at history and to see ourselves in it. And not to look at any African nation, not to look at African nations, especially places where we come from, not to look at them in terms of not having contributed history. And when you think about that, whose job is it going to be to change that? Who's going to change it? Us, you and me. And we have to begin by looking at ourselves. I think sometimes when we see things happen in life, sometimes we expect there's going to be this really big bump, this really big moment that just changes things, or something, I don't know, magical is going to happen in the sky. But really, it's going to be you and I that will change this whole perspective. It's going to be you and I who look at our ancestors differently. It's going to be you and I who teach our children to respect their ancestors. There are children out there who don't even know, from all different walks of life, from all different, colors, creeds, places, who don't respect where they came from, don't respect their grandparents, don't respect their ancestors, don't know their heritage. And when you don't respect your ancestors and you don't know where they came from, people aren't going to respect you. And they don't even realize, they don't even have that idea and that connection, because they're trying to be cool or be like somebody else. And so I think it's very significant. There's another thing. God bless you. God bless you. Peace to you as well. You dealing with real. God bless you. Because if you begin to develop that sense of self-worth, if you begin to understand, and our children begin to understand, that there is power in what our ancestors did. There is power in what they were able to overcome. There was power in what they introduced to the world. So as us, we can't look at anybody's standards of what it is. And, we've talked a lot about this on this channel. Mathematics, where that may have come from and where it may have started, and medicine and different people's contributions and people from all over the world. If we let somebody else continue to frame that for our children, we're going to lose the battle, because you'll never be able to look at yourself and say, I can do that. You'll never be able to look at yourself and really realize that and know that without being the person to stand up first and say, I got God in me. My ancestors had God in me. The people where I come had God in me. People who look like me had God in me. People who are a part of my heritage had God in them. And if we're not able to do that, there are going to be a lot of things, a lot of challenges in life we're not going to be able to face if we can't do that. So that's why I'm having this conversation and talking about it today. And I want to talk about several groups and different types of different people who were there in ancient Nubia and around in ancient Kemet. They were ancient Kemet too, who were names of people who sometimes we just don't know. And I'll give you the names so you can write them down and look at them, or just be aware when you read them. But this whole area that is ancient Kemet that we talk about a lot, obviously there were groups of people there. And it does not mean, guys, because I know somebody will probably put it in the comments, if you talk about Nubians as if they were distinct from Kemetic people, it does not mean that the Kemetic people were not black. It does not mean that the Kemetic people were not African. I think that's an important point to make, because some people assume because you say a Nubian name and you speak their names, that somehow you're saying something about Kemet that they don't believe in, or that's not true. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. We need to speak our ancestors' names no matter who they are. We need to speak them. We can't let the people be crowded over and kind of covered over by ancient Kemet or by anything. We need to speak all their names. We need to be not ashamed of them. And you know what? The reason why is they had their own distinct societies, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we know that there are a lot of different people in there. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just like you saying somebody's from California and another person's from Arizona. It doesn't mean they aren't in the same region, right? It doesn't mean they don't share a lot of the same issues and environment and some of the same history. It doesn't mean they don't share a lot, but somebody's living in Arizona and somebody's living in California, and they call themselves Californians and they call themselves Arizonians, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It does not mean that they don't have a shared experience. It doesn't mean they're not related in some way, but it does mean that we can't let Arizona overshadow California. We need to be able to talk about them. We need to be able to say who they are, because the people who were Nubian people at the time, they had their own societies. They had their own rulers, right? So it would be kind of inappropriate to call them and to lump them completely under Kemetic control when they had their own societies and they had their own rulers and they had their own ways of doing things. And so you respect that. So whether the person's from California or Arizona or Colorado or wherever they might be from, these are all people who had distinct areas within which they lived and distinct political units. They had distinct units around which they organized themselves and how they looked at their leaders and how they went about doing what they needed to do for their own society. So it becomes significant for us to do that. So hopefully you're not, thinking about that or caught up on that, but I think it's important to speak their names and to talk about them. So, and we've talked a little bit about A group Nubians, C group Nubians. These are some of the names that archaeologists have given to ancient Nubian people. But let's kind of talk more about them and speak their names. As you look at it, you'll find that in the area that is Lower Nubia, that's right below where Southern Kemet was, right between the first cataract and the border of the Sudan and today's Egypt, that was where you have Lower Nubia, and you had a lot of C group people, and you had people whose names we're going to mention. And when you go beyond that, farther than that, you start to get to the Kushite people, and when you go east of that, you start to get to the Medjay. And one of the archaeological findings, if you will, that helps support that and helps us understand that is the autobiography of Weni. We're going to talk about the autobiography of Weni. And the other day we talked about the autobiography of Harkuf. And Harkuf was a governor, if you will, an administrator in the southern part of ancient Kemet. And he made some expeditions and some traveling expeditions and trade expeditions into farther south. And he talked about the people that he met. He talked about Yam. He talked about the Twa people and bringing back a man who was a Twa dancer to dance before King Pepi II because he danced the dances of God. We talked about in the past couple of days, we talked about the land of Punt, right? So we know Punt and we can say Punt, and we know that people visited Punt. And somebody was saying down below in the comments that Punt was a mythical land. No, so Punt was Punt. It was a real place. There was a real place that people went. It was a real place that they said their ancestors came from. It was a real place that Hatshepsut sent people to. It was a real place that many people went throughout the land throughout the time period of ancient Kemet. So we know about Punt. We've heard about Kush. We've heard about Yam. Sometimes we've heard about the Twa people mentioned with respect to ancient Kemet. But let's talk about even addition to that, because Harkuf, who was the governor in the southern part of Kemet, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, he was documenting his autobiography and in his expeditions down in the southern part going into Nubia. Before he was that governor, before he was the person who was held that office, an administrator, Weni held it. So before Harkuf was Weni. And Weni also wrote his autobiography. And he put this inscription on his tomb in his temple. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of people who had tombs, and there were temples associated with the tombs. And the temples were the places where their families or priests who had been literally contracted, would come and give offerings and say special prayers and perform certain rituals on behalf of the deceased person so that they continued to live on and continue to be blessed in the afterlife. So this was something that was concluded in the temple tomb, in his temple there in Upper Kemet. And he was, as I mentioned, he was an administrator, just like Harkuf was. And he documented his time and the people he served under. And he served over several kings. He had a long history, if you will. He served under King Teti, Pepi I, and Memre. And he was somebody who lived during the 6th dynasty of ancient Kemet. So he becomes a significant person and one of the earliest autobiographies that we have. Harkuf is a very good one, and Weni is a very good one, who came just before Harkuf. He was his predecessor. So I look at that and I started talking about, I want to kind of talk about, because he says some interesting things that I want to point out that might be of interest to you. So he talks about how he's the governor of the southern part of Kemet, and he talks about how he was a supervisor in Nekton. And if you remember yesterday, we were talking about Heracleopolis and Nekton and the Naqada period and the pre-dynastic period, and how that area around Naqada, which is in the southern part of ancient Kemet, what will become ancient Kemet, was as a center and an important part, and you hear it mentioned a lot. Well, here's one of the places you hear it mentioned. Weni is talking about himself being a supervisor of Nekton. And so he has a family history, or he's working in an area where the dynastic and the history goes back many, many years. It goes back probably 1,000 years over where he is right now in the 6th dynasty. That history is going back 1,000 years of people who were the precursors for the culture that would become Kemet. So I just want to point that out, because that becomes significant, the fact that he's in that area where Nekton is and was, and that he was an official and an honored official, and it kind of gives you an idea of the history that they're thinking about. So as he goes on, he talks about being a young person in the court, if you will, of King Teti, and that how he's helping to serve the king. But he also, God bless you, hope you have a good one. Ancient Ethiopian start. So we can talk about, so in West Ethiopian, and it depends on how you define Ethiopian. So we can talk about that West Ethiopian, because the Ethiopian people obviously have a huge history, and there's so much that's a part of that. Maybe we can touch on that towards the end of this one, or another show we'll be able to touch on that. So talking about Weni, he talks about how he was in Nekton, how he was with the king, and how he served under several kings. And he's mentioned something very interesting, and I want to kind of move myself away here so you can see this, you can read this. He talks about when the king rose up against the sand dwellers. So he, as I mentioned, he's serving under kings in the 6th dynasty. And he talks about when the king rose up against the sand dwellers, and then he talks about people who lived toward the east, to the east of ancient Kemet. They were living in the Sinai toward the east, and in various places up there, even east and west, they sometimes call them sand dwellers. That he convened an army of tens of thousands of men, and that they came from Upper Kemet, Yebu. Now, Yebu is in the very southernmost part of Kemet. So if you look right down here where you see group, right down here where there is like a first cataract, you see C group, you see Medjay, you see the first cataract, you see Ashwan. That's what Yebu is. That's where Elephantine was. So the Greeks much later on, would call it Elephantine, but it's called Yebu. So he mentioned that the king is bringing up tens of thousands of men. He's bringing them from Elephantine. And a lot of times the people who were around this area, around the border of Lower Nubia and ancient Kemet, that traditional border, there were Nubians in and all out there. And let's call their names, not just the Kemetic names. Let's call them, they were in and out there. And he talks about how the king raised up an army from people from Elephantine or Yebu in the south. And he talks about the Miniet in the north. So he's naming the people, the ethnicities and the groups of people, the society of people that he brought from the north, and from Lower Nubia. So that's the northern part of ancient Kemet, and then from all the two sides of the house, and from Sedger and Kadru, and then he mentions the Urjet Nubians. Here's where he starts to mention Nubians by name. He starts to mention Kemetic Nubian people by name, names that we should remember, names we should hear, because they weren't just people whose pictures were on the wall. They had their own organizations, they had their own societies, they were developing their own way, they were contributing to humankind and contributing to one another. And it's very important when you understand, when you're able to hold family groups together, when you're able to make your culture last for thousands of years, when you're able to birth children and to give people a sense of belonging, you are developing a significant part of human history. You're developing a significant part of the human family. And we should not downplay anybody who's able to hold a culture together for hundreds of years or even thousands of years. And we haven't been able to do it yet. Many places nowadays have not been able to do that. So that becomes very significant, right? So he's mentioning people who come from this lower part, this lower Nubia, as you see on the map there. So he says, so part of the army that Weni is going to be a part of and being in charge of, not only do they have people from Sedra and various people, but they had the Urjet Nubians. These were literally societies of Nubians who called themselves the Urjet, the Medjay, the Yam Nubians, which were in upper or farther south, the Wawet Nubians, the Cow Nubians, and the Tajimna, which were people who were from ancient Libya. So he's saying right there, if you look at those names, those are Nubian people. Those are names of Nubian societies, 2,000 years BC, 2,000 years before Christ, who are doing things in the Nubian area, in the area of Northeast Africa. And they are, in this particular case, in the army, working in the army of ancient Kemet. So when we talk about that, and they give you a lot of information about Nubian people being in the armies, there were significant numbers, there were significant amounts of Nubian people who were served in the armies of ancient Kemet throughout its history. So this is Old Kingdom, right? And as I mentioned to you, you take a look at the map, you see how there you have people in pre-dynastic area. You have A group Nubians within the borders of what will become Kemet. You have common things that are happening up and down the Nile Valley, like burial practices in many cases in pre-dynastic Kemet and in Nubia at the same time. They would do burial practices where they would have people in a fetal position. So they would be kind of contracted in a fetal position with their hands above their face, laying on one side, either facing to the west or facing toward the east, in very specific ways with pottery there and a belief in an afterlife. There were similar practices that went on with Nubian people, as well as Kemetic people and pre-dynastic Kemetic people, as well as Nubian people that lasted well beyond and well into the dynastic era of ancient Kemet. So they were practicing these things for a long period of time. And in many cases, you'll find some of the practices that were shared and some of the practices that were Kemetic practices. Nubian people practiced them for a long time after Kemetic people stopped. After Kemet fell and the culture changed, you still had people for over 1,000 years practicing things in ancient Nubia and in ancient Kush that were done thousands of years beforehand. So they were really keeping forth traditions. But if you look at that, as we kind of go back to that, I want you to kind of just remember that. You think about the Urjet Nubians, the Medjay Nubians, the Yam, the Wawet, the Cow. These are real people, real societies, and they're fighting in the armies of ancient Kemet. I mean, you don't get people to fight unless they can fight. And I want to make this point because it becomes significant. This is the Old Kingdom, right? God bless you at the poo. This is the Old Kingdom, that we're talking about, but it wasn't just the Old Kingdom. If you look at the as I mentioned, they're there pre-dynastically, but if you look at the Middle Kingdom, you will find that Mentuhotep II, the man who is credited with rejoining and reunifying the land at the start of the Middle Kingdom after a period of kind of discretion and separation, if you will, the man who's credited with starting the Middle Kingdom, he had Nubians in his army. He had Nubian wives. Specifically, he had Nubians in his army. He spoke about it. Not just that, when you get into the New Kingdom, you will find, even with Hatshepsut and various people, you find depictions of specific ethnicities, Nubians in Kemetic armies. Doesn't mean that they don't have a shared heritage. Doesn't mean they don't have things in common, but they did have distinct cultures and they had distinct societies. And the reason, just like you have somebody, as I mentioned, who might be living in California and another person living in Arizona, does not mean that they don't have a shared experiences and a shared environment and they're culturally connected, but it does mean that they have some distinctions. It does mean that they have their own rulers. And I don't want to discount the people who were rulers and who were in charge of the Urjet and the Wawet and the Sedra. I don't want to discount that because I think that becomes a significant thing that we can look at. So as we kind of look at that, I kind of want to pull their names up and kind of give that some heyday there. We don't want to discount what they did. We don't want to forget them. We don't want to pretend like and just use the name Nubians, which is okay because I know we use the name. We'll say, Americans. We may say Europeans. We may say names that are kind of general, but I think it's important for us to get to know their names, right? Because the Wawet had people who were rulers of them. The Cow and the Medjay had their own society. They had their own structure that they developed, that they followed, so we should. And a lot of times when people will say very racist or biased things about Nubian people and the Wawet and the Urja, this is what they're talking about, but they just lump them all into one big thing. And it's up to you and I not to do that. It's up to you and I to understand that these are people, and we shouldn't do this for people in Eastern Africa. We shouldn't do this for people in societies in Western Africa, Central Africa, anywhere in the world. We shouldn't do this. But in particular, when you're looking at your heritage, we shouldn't let people diss our ancestors. Why do we let people do that? I mean, think about very many people around the world and how, they respect, or at least they have some idea. They don't want to let you diss their heritage. Why do we let people do that? And we ourselves at times, and obviously it's because there's been a whole issue and a whole effort to make us not do that. There's a whole racist effort to make us not do that. But we can't, in this day and age, sit back and look at anything in Africa with shame. Sit back and look at and not examine that and examine the pride, what it takes to be human, what it takes to fight against the things that they fought against, what it takes to be first. What does it take to be around for hundreds of thousands of years and to bring people and human beings to almost every corner of the globe, to bring people to everywhere, right? To spread around the whole world, to develop things that sometimes we won't even know, that won't even be passed on because it's so long ago. To pass on things that might have been in writing in some way, or might have been lost, or in language and passed on orally that may have been forgotten. What does it take to do the things that many of the ancestors and the human ancestors and the people who helped to start us and kick us off and move us forward? What does it take to do that? And I think that it's important for us not to disrespect them, not to look at people in Africa and Western Africa, where a lot of us have heritage from, and look at that with any type of shame, because to do that is to take away your own power. You are destroying your own aspect and your own connection to power when you don't respect your ancestors, when you don't remember their names, when you don't call them out. So we know it now, right? It's the 21st. We know it now. We can get on AI, we can do ChatGPT, we can do anything. If you're online looking at this, if you have a Facebook account, a YouTube account, we can also Google. We can also figure out things. We know it now. It's our ability, and it's up to us and our responsibility to talk about these things and to make sure that this is gotten out and that our children know it. And they should have respect, and they should have honor for everybody around the world. They should have honor for everybody's contributions, in particular their own. In particular, the ones that come through them, in particular, whose blood they have running through their veins, they should have respect for that as well. In particular, one that's a part of their heritage. So I think that's a very significant thing. So as we look at that, and I want to mention, because there are a lot of things happening. It's not just what's happening in Lower Nubia, if you will. It's also things that are happening in the upper parts. When we look at the southern part, right there near where Khartoum is today, and in the Sudan, right around there, there's also things going on in that area. So it isn't just what's happening up here in Lower Nubia and the Urjet and the Wawet and the Cow, which are amazing right there. You also have people in the southern part who were called Yam at one period of time. They were called Yam. And then also the Kushite people, right? And so the Kushite people is very interesting. The Kushite people, the first time in history you hear the word Kush mentioned is during the 12th dynasty in ancient Kemet during the Middle Kingdom. And you hear them talk about with King Sweseret I. And he's talking about with respect to a coalition of people who were in this area of Kush and this whole area, basically fighting against them, basically coming against them. And at this point in time, in the Middle Kingdom, they had built several forts coming down from Upper Kemet, had built several forts on this frontier in the first cataract and is around the second cataract of Nile. And they were basically saying, we have some people down here who are formidable foes, who are formidable enemies, who are kind of strong and powerful, and we need to put up some forts. We need to have some protection in place, because there's also a very important trade route that's taking place up and down this Nile, and we're getting some stuff we like, that we want and we need for our religious ceremonies, like ebony and ivory and panther skins, which priests wore. More gold, even though they had access to gold, more gold, various things, and incense that was very important in their ceremonies and in their rites and their religious ceremonies. And so they wanted to be able to control that. And the kingdom that was set up at Kerma, that had already been there well before the 12th dynasty, and the people that were there, they had their own connections. They had their own rights of their own. They had their own trade routes. They had their own societies. And here, Kemet is coming, building a fort right there around the second cataract. There was some friction there. So you see a mention of the Kushite people, and you see them mentioning not just Kush, but they mention a whole list of people, a whole list of people who were apparently either neighbors of or in a coalition with ancient Kush against the Kemetic people. Now, we don't know if the whole area was called Kush at that time or if it was just Kush was the most powerful, but Kush was mentioned first. So does that mean it was the most powerful? Was it the leader? It's hard to know, that the inscription does not say, but there are people in the Middle Kingdom here who are formidable foes, and they're even long before the Middle Kingdom, they're there, and they're rivals to ancient Kemet. At times they're conquered by ancient Kemet. There are times when Kush conquers Kemet. There are times when Kush pushes back into here. So that back and forth goes. Not that Kemet wasn't powerful, but they're rivals of ancient Kemet. And they're giving them a run for their money. They're giving them a run for their money. That's why they're setting up forts. And that's why Kemet is paying so much attention to them, because these people are powerful. They're controlling trade routes. And it's not just they're just subjugating them. They want the gold. They want the resources. They want to have control over that. And Kushite people had control of it. So there were times where they were going to be bumped. They were bumping heads. And ancient Kemet wanted to control more of what Kush had. But that being said, as you look at that, you're going to find various things with respect to Kush that they did, various things that were significant in that area that is upper in the southern part of Nubia, if you will. And as you can see, some of the religious facilities and things that they created. This is one of the Dafufas, which is a temple that's in the area of the ancient city of Kerma. And that's one of the things that were built thousands of years ago. This is one of their centers in their city center, one of their religious facilities, which I've talked about and we'll talk more about. But they weren't just the people that were in Yam, the people that were in Kush, the people that were in Nubia. They weren't just going around kind of, having this idea that people are twiddling their thumbs. That's absolutely not what was doing. They had their own societies. They had their own contributions. They had their own distinct ways they did things. It did not mean that they were not culturally connected with ancient Kemet, but it did mean that they had their own lives. They had their own rulers. Think about it. A lot of times we get mad when we talk about them in ways that are distinct, but they had their own rulers. They had their own kings. They had their own burial customs that were similar to what they were doing in pre-dynastic eras, but they were also somewhat uniquely Kushite, uniquely Medjay. They had little things that they did that were specific to them, that obviously if you develop your own society, if you have your own king, if you have your own elders, you have your own rulers, you're going to have your own culture. And you may be connected with, like Arizona is to California, you may be connected with and related to them, but you're going to have some things that you do in distinction. And one of the other things they did was some wonderful pottery. They also did. So there's going to be some distinctions between you when you go and you have your own societies and your own rulers. But I want to talk about a couple other things as I look at that, as we start to talk about and think about some of the other things that they did. In addition to that, when he talks about, so not only did he have these Nubians, as well as other people, Libyan people, what we call Lemni Dechimna, as well as other people who were from the northern part of ancient Kemet. But he had these cow Nubians and white Nubians. He had them as a part of his army. And he mentions that the king sends them at the head of the army. Women, he says, I'm at the head of the army, and he has royal seal bearers with him, and he is going, and he has people with him, as he mentioned, from upper Kemet and lower Kemet, and he had a whole group of people. He were at the head of the troops of the cities that ruled, and from the Nubians of those lands. So he talked about how they're bringing Nubians as a part of his army again, and that he was at the head of these troops, and that he was ruling people who were rulers of other lands and other cities. A lot of times in ancient Kemet, if you had a fight going on, if there was a war, and you were like maybe a ruler of a local town, you had to go fight too. It wasn't just completely that, everybody you fought too. At times, kings fought. Thutmose III, Ramses said, people were out there fighting, and you were not excluded from fighting just because you were a ruler of a local town. Sometimes even priests had to fight. So this is back in the day. This is, hundreds, thousands of years ago. You needed an army, you needed people to fight. So you might have to fight even if you were a so-called, elite type of person, right? You had to fight. There you go. In Irish, French, and German. Yeah, the same people. There you go. God bless you. Rainwater, God bless you. African, there you go. So you have people who are similar. Include people who call it Nubian today. Oh, that's very good. There are some people who are still Nubian, apparently of the same heritage today. So we could talk more about that too. So he talks about, so he's at the head of this troop. He also mentions that while he was commander, the soldiers behaved with honor. That these Nubians and Libyans and northern Kemetic people, that they behaved with honor. None of them attacked the neighbors. Nobody walked through these towns and these cities where they were going, where they had to fight the quote unquote sand dwellers. Nobody took things. Nobody stole and mistreated the local people. Imagine that. Think about running an army where the army is just not acting like, killing people and destroying people who are innocent citizens. A lot of armies today do that. A lot of armies today do that. They're supposed to be helping, and they're in places where they're supposed to be giving resources and helping, and they're abusing people. And he's talking about how those things did not happen under my watch. We didn't have those things happening. And he talks about the army returned safely, and it destroyed the sand dwellers. So the people that they were fighting who were Asiatic, they destroyed them, is what they're saying. And so he goes to talk about how he went on and did more. And he talks about that the king sent him again to a place called Iphap in Nubia. And this is something that you may not think about. This is another area in Nubia, giving your name Iphap in Nubia, to help build a sarcophagus, get back a sarcophagus that was going to be used as a chest for the king in Memory's pyramid, if you will. And so here you start to talk about, and somebody asked the question, how do they build pyramids? Well, he talks about here some of the ways he went to go get on expeditions to get resources to bring back. And he got them sometimes from Nubia. And this particular one, he's talking about getting some resources from Nubia to bring back to be using in the final resting place of the king, one of the kings of the 6th dynasty at that time. And he's talking about Memory. So as he's doing that, he's got to move forward. And I'll check the chat just real quick. Yeah. So, God bless you. So there are some people who are still Nubian today. And so we will, yes. And it is a belief that Nubians were only Kushite. They were not only Kushite. They would have been people, not just Cushitic people that were Nubians. That's a good point. It's a larger area than just what would be considered upper or the southern part of Nubia. That was one area that people called Nubia. That was one region. So they would not have been just the Kushite people. You would have other people who would have been Nubian, right? Even farther north than that. So he goes on to talk about that he's in this area, and he's going to this place called Iphap, a place in Nubia, and he's going again to the southern part of Kemet, and that he is doing many things to help bring back resources that are going to be in Memory's pyramid that he will take farther north from the resources that he's bringing. He says something also that's kind of interesting later on here. He talks about how he is bringing boats from Nubia. So he talks about how the king sent him, and I'll show you this right here so you can kind of read through it. He talks about the king sent him to the farther south place, almost on that border that's right around there. If you look at that border, right where Ashwan, where you see C Group meets Medjay, that's kind of where the first cataract is on that picture of that map right there. That whole area was a significant area. That was kind of a gateway. At the first cataract, the cataract is a rocky area. It's a rocky area where at certain times of the year, when the Nile is not flooded, when it's not high, it's really difficult to get a boat over it because it's a lot of rocks, and sometimes they actually had to get out of the Nile, the river, and pull their boats across land because it was that dangerous to stay in the water. So you have 6 major rocky areas like that up and down now. Most of them are in Nubia. So one of the reasons why Kemet has somewhat of an advantage, and you can tell me what you think down in the comments below. One of the reasons why Kemet had such an advantage was because it had a border where it went from the first cataract on the southernmost border all the way out to the Mediterranean with no cataracts. So that first cataract becomes its southern border. And beyond that, north of that, it's pretty much smooth sailing. So they can go up and down, ancient Nubia. Okay. So that they can pretty much go up and down with some freedom. Now, once you start to get into lower Nubia and into upper Nubia, you have more cataracts. You start the first cataract and then the second cataract when you get into today's Sudan. And as you go down the Nile, kind of going southerly, if you will, you'll find the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th cataract. So that makes that area a little more challenging. And the Nubians obviously navigated it, right? They navigated it well because they did all kinds of trade routes going up and down there. But it gives you just some idea of the terrain that they were dealing with and the manner in which they had to relate that. So God bless you. Hopefully you're doing well. So as you think about that, the Weni in his autobiography is saying that he was around the first cataract where Yebu is in Elephantine, right there where you see C Group and Medjay. And he's saying, the king sent me here. And he sent me here to create 5 canals. So think about that. The Kemetic people, a lot of times at the time, they were doing a lot of things with digging, making dams or canals, or directing the waterways in ways in which they could trade more and have more freedom, bringing resources up and down. And so you would have been working with a lot of Nubian people if you were doing those types of things, especially if you were doing it around the first cataract, if you will. So as he did that, he's talking about how he not only did he build 5 canals, which was amazing, that he also built barges. So you can see he built 3 cargo boats and barges and 4 towboats. So if you take a look at that, he's talking about how he built these barges and he built 4 towboats of acacia wood from Wawat, Nubia. he's talking about, okay, I'm going down to where Nubia is. I'm going down below the first cataract, and I'm building these towboats and barges for the king, for the king of the sixth dynasty, one of the kings of the sixth dynasty, and that I'm also getting this wood specifically from Auset, which is an area and a people in Nubia. We're going to call their names again. Because he's talking about having them in their army as well as working with them. And then he said the rulers of the Urjet, of the Auset, of the Yam, and the Medjay, these are all areas that we mentioned there in Nubia, south of the Kemetic border, were helping him by cutting the wood for them. I did all this in 1 year. So he was saying that the rulers were actually helping out, that they were getting their people in support of building these boats that were going to be used for King Menoreh, and towboats as well as barges and things of that nature. They were going to be used to help transport things up and down resources that were in Nubia, transferring them to Kemet. Now, does this sound like a situation where this was a subjugation? He not only just said that he's working with them to help build boats, and that the rulers are getting in on it and helping him to build boats that are significant for the king. He says he's building canals, and he also says that he had them in his army, that these are people in his army. So you already see them having people in the army who are Urjet and Auset and Cow and Medjay, as well as working with them and doing trade with them and helping to build resources like boats and getting resources like wood and acacia wood and other resources that will be used for the sarcophagus of King Menoreh. So you begin to see that the Nubian people had their own societies, and it wasn't just simply a situation where they were being subjugated. They were being worked with. They were being partnered with. They had their own strengths and their own societies going up and down there now. So whether you're talking about the southern part of Nubia, where Kush it was, in the ancient city of Kerma, where they had temples and things of that nature, or if you go a little farther up and you're talking about Sigurd the Medjay or the Urjet, or the Auset up there in Lower Nubia, or if you go further east and you talk about the Medjay, or even before that when you talk about pre-Kerma or the A-group Nubians, you have a significant amount of Nubians. And I want to remember their names. These are distinct peoples whose names we should remember, and we should be proud of them, as well as the Puntites and the Twa people and various people like that. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. I'll take a look at the chat to see some of the things you guys are saying, but I very much appreciate you joining me. Please tell somebody about this. Please share this. Let's get this out there, and let's get their names out there. And I'll take a peek real quick at the chat. Neolithic people. Okay. We'll start looking. So, okay. We'll look. There you go. Okay. There you go. God bless you. So, there you go. God bless you. So I'm going to Kushite and Cham put all the lands south Kemet. Now people use a Nubian name for everybody. Yeah, so they had their specific names. They were more than just one different people. So God bless you. I thank you guys for joining in so much. I'm gonna take a look at it and see if I can respond to you. But I very much appreciate you sharing, and please share this with somebody. Let's tell somebody about this, and let's get the word out. God bless you. Thank you so much for listening.